My dear friends, I have for many years loved and appreciated you deeply, but today I also stand in awe of you. This morning I had the distasteful experience of discussing gay rights with Kevin Thibodeau in front of some of the most self-righteous people I've ever encountered. Yes, there were some sympathetic people in the room, but they felt so intimidated they only whispered their agreement and support. And yes, as you might imagine, I held my own, firmly and with conviction. But I had the experience today that gays, lesbians, and bisexuals must have daily, an awareness of potential danger, of the need to be wary, of being out of step with my surroundings. Even as a white woman, I don't usually feel this, but now I know what it must be like in a way I didn't know before. So my dear friends, my admiration now matches my affection. With love, Leslie.
Sexual orientation is one of those issues that has divided people, and it ought not divide people.
And if you don't start standing up and saying, no, that's not right, well, then it's going to affect our entire society in lots of ways. It'll be much harder to undo later.
As an ally of other people who have experienced various kinds of oppressions that I haven't experienced, it would be a contradiction for me to do anything other than to be right with them in the fight, because it's my fight. It's the same fight that I've gone through.
If they can pick on gay people today, who are we going to pick on tomorrow? It could be me. So I'm standing up for my rights just as much as any gay person.
That may be that you stand alone, but better that you stand alone and have your principles and your integrity, and you can wake up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror and know that you've done what you need to do.
In 1992, Colorado voters passed Amendment 2, the nation's first statewide anti-gay initiative. Proponents said it outlawed special rights for gays and lesbians, while opponents claimed it legalized discrimination. Caught in the middle were the majority of citizens of Colorado, many of whom had never thought about gay rights. This program focuses on some of those citizens who took a stand, the inner journeys they took in deciding to act, and the ultimate conflict that took place within their own hearts and minds.
It perhaps is because what's a nice heterosexual lady doing on an issue like this? It's not what people maybe expected. I reached inside, I realized that I feel very strongly about this issue. I feel strongly that love in whatever form ought to be celebrated and supported, and that it is not right for any society, it is not right for any community to pick bases on which we will discriminate and make things unfair for people in our community.
In my tradition, we have an expression that is that when God created the world, God created human beings, B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. And I believe that all human beings are created in God's image. Tall, short, thin, fat, black, white, gay or straight, we are all, in my opinion, created in God's image. And if that is the case, then we are all deserving, every one of us is deserving of dignity from another human being.
There's always been people of a different orientation than myself in my life. And I think where that really became more clear was when I began to attend seminary. There was a fair number of gay and lesbian students there and had no real sense of, I came into the church and into ministry feeling I had gifts to offer. I had never seen a role model as a woman, as an example, but had a sense of this was something in which I was gifted, and of course I should be allowed to do this. When I came to seminary, here were many, many gay and lesbian friends of mine that were very gifted, very committed to the church, very solid Christian people, but not being sure what their future would be like when they completed their degree and began seeking ordination or other kinds of positions in the church. And I think that the fairness and unfairness of that was just crystal clear.
When my son told me that he was gay, it was a very emotional evening. We spent the whole night getting reacquainted, and he told me about so many things that he had never shared with me before about the pain that he had. He had suffered from very high blood pressure from the time he was 13. And that's about the time that he started putting labels on who he was. And I can remember thinking, my God, no child should ever have to go through that. And almost coincident with that thought was, but they'll have to, because no one will ever do anything. I mean, that's really how I saw it at that time, that it was something so insurmountable we couldn't do anything about it. We just had to accept it.
Homophobia was probably more intense in the black community than it was in the white community. And knowing that there were people who I loved and trusted and respected, who had struggled all their lives with racism, who seemed totally unaware of the connections and the similarities between racism and homophobia, and having to speak out and say, look, I think we're in bad shape with this.
And some people told me, even friends told me, that was not an issue I should have even gotten into. But as I told a friend of mine when she came for EPOC, Judy Harrington, and asked me to sign as one of the individuals supportive of EPOC, that just because I was running for a position, political position, that I couldn't give up my principles, I couldn't give up my integrity, and that I had to be very frank about what I would stand for.
As the campaign progressed, the sides became more and more polarized. The Colorado Springs-based group Colorado for Family Values, headed by Will Perkins and Kevin Thibodeau, led the push to pass Amendment 2. They waged an effective campaign based on a no special rights slogan. In many respects, Colorado became a testing ground for the religious rights cultural war.
This message is a must for every Christian, every God-fearing American to hear. You'll receive 2 behind-the-scenes exposés, which you cannot get anywhere else in the world, shot by our own undercover film crews who went incognito to Washington. And they got the expose of the Clinton inaugural gala, the very first inaugural gala of gays and lesbians endorsed and addressed by the president. And secondly, an expose of the gay and lesbian agenda. Allegedly 1 million gays and lesbians marched on Washington April 25th. Our 2 camera crews were there. Nobody knew who they were. They got it all.
It's an idea that really began developing in the mid-1980s in a fairly concrete sense with the rise of AIDS, and that conjoined with a history in some far-right religious groups of being adamantly opposed to homosexuality. And AIDS sort of gave what was a very, very fringe little effort some currency.
I do not know of anywhere in California statute that the word sexual orientation has ever been defined in statute. Here it's defined as 3 things. It's defined as homosexuality, bisexuality, and heterosexuality. All at once, we have the overhauling of straight America.
Lewis Sheldon's group on the West Coast, Pat Robertson's group on the East Coast, were putting together a couple of conferences that gave rise to what then James Dobson's Focus on the Family actually put out. And those were packets for neighborhood grassroots groups to work on obtaining anti-gay rights initiatives. So this is something that certainly wasn't homegrown.
Special Rights for Gays forces the law to protect this behavior. Do we want to protect Colorado? Yes, we do. Vote yes on 2.
Coloradans for Family Values was quite successful in exploiting that there's not enough to go around feeling. There's not enough. If civil rights protections are afforded to individuals based on sexual orientation, then that will take away from you, Joe, Black American. That will take away from your civil rights.
People of color fought long and hard for civil rights in this country. We were fighting to protect our ethnic birthrights and not for the choice of someone's bed partner.
Homosexuals have equal rights. They're demanding special rights, and that's not fair. Do we want to stop it in Colorado? Yes, we do. Vote yes on 2.
Well, one of the things that we put into evidence in the lawsuit were those little newspaper-type brochures 850,000 of them, at least, were delivered to doorsteps the week before the 1992 general election. It was really distorted and hate-mongering kinds of political advertisement, and very, very similar to the types of things that have been used in other places to promote discrimination on the basis of race or discrimination against Jews.
There was much comment made about how homosexuals as a quote-unquote class of people were not economically disadvantaged. And it killed me to hear black folks talking about that. Money really doesn't have anything to do with discrimination. Like I was saying, in Germany, did money save rich Jews? I'm sure rich Jews were killed in Hitler's gas chambers, just like Jews who did not have as much money.
People had somehow found a way to couch this particular oppression in different terms and to say that it wasn't really oppression. That when the Ku Klux Klan killed people in the South, that was oppression. But if somebody got killed because they were gay or lesbian, that wasn't really. And I was outraged. I don't know, it touched something really deep inside of me. I think I can remember feeling like, well, if it has its limits in this case, I wonder what kind of limits it would have in terms of people's response to things that I was going through.
I was very reacted by Amendment 2 in ways that surprised me, that I couldn't stop thinking about it, I worried about it, I was having very strong reactions to it, and I tried to sort through that and understand why this was such a big thing for me, and I think that's something I talked with Ellen about also. So you know, in that process of doing it, I think that I became aware that the roots of this had to do with my own experience as a child and what the Holocaust was and what I felt about it. There was a whole lot of shame that I was aware of about being a Jew that came from not, you know, from hearing these things about Jews just walking into cars and being sent to furnaces, and that was a feeling of shame, and I think that was something that, at least in the synagogue that I went to, that was something that was talked about a lot, that we can't let this happen again. It was one of the lessons of the Holocaust, and that's what I found myself experiencing about this was, you know, something terrible could happen here, and if I don't do something about it.
It wasn't that many years ago in America's history when the government turned on its Japanese American citizens. The war brought about a national stress that caused neighbors to turn against neighbors.
I entered the concentration camps at a very young age. I was 7 months old, but I was there until I was 4. So I have very strong memories of the camp, the barbed wire, the guard towers with the soldiers with the rifles in their hands, living through dust storms every day. And of course, I didn't know then the reasons why we were forced to live in those conditions, the racism, so that if being a U.S. citizen didn't protect me from being imprisoned by my own country, there isn't much that one can do or say or be that couldn't land you into a difficult situation just on any pretext. So it is with all of that understanding that it was just a very natural thing then to be supportive of the issues around gay, lesbian, and bisexual rights.
Allies began speaking out against Amendment 2 for many different reasons, and local religious denominations were divided over which side to take. For some religious leaders, it was clear that they had to take a stand in support of Amendment 2. However, other religious leaders read the same Bible and came to a different conclusion.
I think, wasn't it Jesus that one time said, even the devil can quote Scripture? I think that the Scripture is terribly misused. The way I like to say it is I take the Bible much too seriously to take it literally. So I want to know what the great principles of the Bible are. The great principle of the Bible is justice, and love and peace. These are the great things, not the picayune laws. And we have misused the Bible so often to justify putting slaves down, putting black people down, putting women down. It seems to me that you can find reasons to do that in the scriptures on all of those things, including gay and lesbian persons. But by and large, the great witness of the scripture is to justice and acceptance and love and including in the circle of faith.
We have a huge debate in the rabbinic community in Denver. I mean, the rabbinical council broke up over this issue. That's painful. It's very painful. But I still think you have to say what you believe to be correct. And there's certain limits beyond which you don't go. You know, I believe in compromise. I believe in give and take. But I don't believe in give and take to the point where you give away someone else's rights in order to satisfy this person and their religious beliefs.
Coming up to our vote on Amendment 2, the Presbyterian Church was looking at this amendment as a justice issue, whether it was just and whether it was right. And we felt it was wrong. We felt it was wrong to put standards that were different for different groups. And I did a lot of thinking about the outcasts in the days of Jesus, who were the lepers. And they were set outside the community and people could not have any communication with them. There was a great deal of fear. And so they were shut out. And Jesus went out to them. I thought, my goodness, this is so similar to what is happening to the homosexual in society today. And if Jesus were here, I know he would be with the outcasts of society, trying to bring them back into community. So I believe that that's what I am to be about.
There's one couple who went through a divorce fairly early in my ministry here because the man had realized that he was a homosexual. It was that individual who came back several years later and said, we have a metropolitan community church that is worshiping in Pueblo, and we're looking to find a church home. It took us about 9 months to really sort through that dilemma. We wavered a little bit back and forth, but there were many, many people, there still are in this congregation, who have brothers and sisters and nephews and friends who are gay and lesbian, and said, if these people are not welcome in this congregation, then neither am I. And at the end of that time period, voted to extend a lease arrangement with this other congregation that serves primarily a gay and lesbian population. We lost a number of people over that, but on the other hand, it was a very clarifying moment for this church to take a stand, to say, yes, we believe that God's love is for all people, that God's arms are large enough for all of us.
As religious leaders began solidifying their positions, other concerned citizens began seeing the world with changing eyes.
One young man particularly is a very good friend of mine, an activist that grew up in Escuela Tlatelolco Alternative School in the Crusade for Justice, and came out of the closet at a very difficult time in his life, and did so with a great deal of dignity and grace, and asked the question of me and many of us that were actively involved in human rights, why are my rights different? I mean, wouldn't you be willing to stand up for me? And aside from their own personal love and commitment to him as a friend, I realized that was something we were going to have to confront as a community and confront as human rights activists. And that was not a discussion we had in the Chicano Latino community.
When you first start, homophobia it doesn't look like a big deal. To me, homophobia meant that you were uncomfortable with gay people, or you were kind of a little bit afraid, or you maybe believed things that weren't really true. And it seemed pretty curable. It seems like, you educate people and they'll get over homophobia. If you go and be a friend to a gay person, they won't be homophobic anymore. And then the gay people would feel more included in a society. But as I went through the 6-8 months here, I saw homophobia. I'm not even sure that's what it was anymore, as a matter of fact, because it was something much more vicious.
When the Anti-Violence Project came to one of our trainings and talked about the level of violence that there was in Colorado toward gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, and but quite frankly, I had thought about this as I was becoming a trainer because we train a lot at night. There's just a couple of us, but I think it really came home to me at that moment that that I could be a target of violence and be seen as gay, lesbian, or bisexual and have someone bash me thinking that that's who I was.
The night before the election, I had volunteered to be one of those persons who waved signs on corners. And I had been assigned, or volunteered actually, for Auraria Parkway and Spear downtown. And that evening it started to snow early in the afternoon. And I've worked downtown before and I know people leave early. We were supposed to be there at 5. And so I got to my corner half an hour early. And I was the only one on the corner, so I was trying to do both flows of traffic. And there was a man in a pickup truck in the center lane who changed lanes and started right at me, and it was snowing and it was slick. And I really thought he was going to run me over. I really did. And my reaction, I was just frozen to the spot with my sign. He slammed into the curb, and he rolled his window down, and he spit at me. And he said, "Fuck you, dyke." And he drove off. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I had just a little inkling of what it's like to be gay. That man hated me. I mean, his spit didn't touch me, but his hate just washed over me.
Being challenged, either verbally or non-verbally, but you knew the challenge was being directed at me, in this case, for my moral values, was fundamentally disempowering. And the sense that the usual techniques that I think most of us use in terms of our language, our skill at convincing people, or at least presenting a point of view to cause other people to think, if not necessarily to agree with us, those skills and those tools were totally without any power. And that it was, I was being cast as a representative of something evil. When I believe as strongly as I can and as fundamentally as I can that what I was believing, what I do believe, what I was representing is right. It was a brand new, I can't remember a time when I have been so challenged and so shaken in my role as mayor or in my own personal point of view.
The challenges of opposing Amendment 2 brought up many unexpected issues for these heterosexual allies. They were as basic as physical safety and as fundamental as personal identity.
People wonder if I'm in fact a lesbian in disguise. And I get that question all the time about, why do you think this is so important to you? And why is this something that you're taking on? It's not your issue. And then a kind of raise of an eyebrow I feel or perceive, whether it's there or not, that suggests that people wonder if I've been a lesbian, if I'm bisexual, if I'm sure of my sexual orientation.
Part of what can drive anger for me in being an ally is a constant concern of being decontextualized in the work I do, in the statements I make. That somehow my concern must have to do with my being a lesbian because there's no understanding that it's an appropriate concern for everyone. Certainly it is for me.
All too often when stands are taken, no matter what the issues are, people think that individuals who take those stands have a vested interest in that stand. I have a vested interest, not because I'm gay, I'm not. I don't have gay children that I know of. I don't have gay brother, I don't have a gay sister. It's not a personal matter with me. It is a communal matter with me. And that's hard to get people to realize that because sometimes people think that you're so invested in this, you're invested in it because you have a vested interest. And I don't. That's the most difficult part for me, is to influence people on the issue purely because I believe in the issue. Second most difficult issue is the abuse that people take over supporting an unpopular cause.
People were going to challenge, I think, my own orientation. I think initially that there was some fright around that. I mean, personally now, in terms of where I was then and where I am now, I mean, I almost laugh and I think about, so what? But I think initially, for me, that's what it was. It was the whole notion that someone may or may not continue to be friends with me, associate with me, and it's not just from the straight community, but also from within my own ethnic background. As a Latino, what exactly did that mean? And I was frightened that other people would think, But it all leads into a whole other notion that I think people of color sometimes tend to forget that we are also gay, lesbian, bisexual too, and so that was a whole other issue. I mean, you couldn't possibly be, you identify as a person of color and you need to stick with that. And I used to think that if I talked about gay, lesbian, bisexual issues, then it kind of discounted everything else I've been working on. And so those were real struggles for me, real struggles.
It's equally difficult to handle the mistrust of the gay, lesbian, and bisexual community, who wonder, probably appropriately, what's in it for me to be doing this work, not trusting me. So I end up in a not unfamiliar place, which is I'm sort of like one of something, and I'm not, my motivations aren't trusted anywhere, so that I can easily get sort of flipped into my own homophobia.
It was a yellow button, and in big red letters it said, "How dare you presume I'm straight?" Well, it was like, uh-oh. It was come to Jesus time for Dani. I realized I didn't want to put the button on. Now, always wanting to save face here, I put the button on because it was the right thing to do, but the really important thing for me was I realized that I had qualms about wearing it, and I had qualms about wearing it because I wondered, well, I assumed that everybody who saw me wearing that button would assume that I was lesbian. It's one thing to vote the correct way or the way that honors human rights. It's another to speak out in a way that honors people's basic human rights. It's another thing to really look inside and realize your own limitations. I'm not talking about my being a lesbian. I'm not lesbian. I'm talking about realizing that I wasn't comfortable by wearing that button with the fact that other folks might think I was. And it had never really occurred to me. I've been asked before, well, boy, you speak out so much on these issues. You seem to have such a good understanding. Has anybody ever thought you were lesbian before? And it's like, well, I don't know. I honestly hadn't thought about it. But in this case, where I had that little yellow button with big red letters, there is no way around it. And I realized my envelope was being pushed.
So it's a hard place, it's a hard path to walk on, to have my motivations questioned, to be able to stand up and be counted when sometimes I'm afraid, both of harm to myself and of being misunderstood, of not being able to speak in a politically correct way, which has ultimately the effect of muting me.
Silence is tempting when identity is questioned. However, being questioned sometimes strengthens the need to stand as a witness. For some, it may be lasting youthful impressions that are deciding factors in taking action.
My aunt was a remarkable person, was a PE teacher, was a real strong person in my life. She was like the kind of aunt that you would always want to have. She always knew the right kind of presents to buy. Wherever she went, she always took me or my sister with her. She was, I wouldn't say she was a lot of fun, but she just was very predictable, very consistent, very kind, very loving, and always had a woman friend, and spent summers with a woman friend. And somewhere along the line, I figured out that she was a lesbian. And I also figured out that she was one of those people that had two lives. She had her summer life, and because she was a school teacher, she had her school year life. And I never really have ever even talked to her about that. I just knew that the day that school got out, she went away for the summer, and there was always a woman with her. It was always the same woman. And I can remember when her mate died, and how I really spent a lot of time laboring over a letter to her about what a loss that might be for her. And I think that was one of the first times that I realized that for her was like a husband dying. And in our family, I think we talked about that a little bit.
Both Mamie and Marcia, who were the two women that I lived with, really rescued me when Mother had spanked me every single day. And Mamie used to help me cook. And as a 4- and 5-year-old, she'd bake me rhubarb pies. And Marcia would take me to her office and let me play office in her office. And I loved them very much, and they loved me when I thought my mother didn't. And it was years later that I realized they were lesbian. They lived together, they slept together, they loved each other. And I had experienced them parenting me when my own parents couldn't. This came out very late in life and in therapy. And it was such a powerful thing that I shared that story. And it was a powerful story for everybody there. I was crying, and I said, I just wish I could thank Mamie and Marcia. And the crowd began to chant, Mamie, Marcia, Mamie, Marcia, and I was absolutely thrilled and touched deeply.
I had a very, very dear friend in high school who we never spoke about really who we were, but I always knew there was a certain sense of safety, that we could just simply be friends. There was no competitiveness or none of this male-female juggling, and just, I guess, having a sense of there were people in my life that were different than myself and lived some very privately agonizing situations, and having to be very careful about with whom they associated, or how did they present themselves, or where did they live.
I think that I had the same kind of reaction that maybe many parents have, where you have that moment where you think that something that you did in terms of raising that child caused a particular kind of circumstance. And but that only lasted for a little while. And then it was moving forward from there to, of course, my concerns about my daughter and how life might affect her adversely, because she is not only an Asian, a female, and now a lesbian, that she would have even more kinds of issues with which to struggle.
My very first client was a gay man who had actually been a student at the university and had heard about me because of other things that I had done, and I think probably would have wanted to see a gay therapist if there was one available, but there wasn't one, and so I was sort of the next best choice. And so I began seeing him, and he was a man with a lot of really serious problems, and one of the first things that came up in the therapy was his concern about whether I would attribute all of these problems that he had to his sexual orientation. And it was really the first time that I had been confronted with that on that direct a level. And I was really aware that right away that this was really not that different from racism or any other kind of ism that I kind of had experienced.
You wouldn't dream today of going into schools and calling someone, I have to say the N-word, can't get it to come out. But it's okay to go into schools and call the little boys fags and the little girls dykes. And a lot of the teachers never hear it because a lot of it's done in situations where no person in authority hears it. So they really can't even believe it's happening. But it does. And it hurts my kids. and I don't think they're gay.
My youngest daughter, at the middle school, when she was in 6th grade when Amendment 2 was on the ballot. And I came from work to pick her up, and I was wearing a button that said, "I love my gay son." And so Michelle was outed in front of all of her 6th grade playmates. And I didn't really even think about what that would mean to her. She was gay bashed. If your brother is gay, you must be too. And the dyke and lesbo, and there were obscene messages left on our answering machine for her from other children.
Kids in middle school, when they're mean to each other, it stays with those kids for life. It doesn't go away. I think in elementary school, things just kind of run off each other's backs, the kids' backs, because they don't even know what some of the words are that they're using, and they know it doesn't feel good, but they don't really know what it is. But about middle school, kids start to really internalize those kinds of hateful things that other people are saying to them, and it feels terrible, and it never goes away. So knowing that, I wanted to make my classroom the kind of classroom where all kids felt like they would be safe and they would be accepted.
I've heard quite a lot. There's a gay student at our school who just came last year, and he is very out. And it's actually, I'm surprised about the reaction has been very positive, much more positive than any of us would have thought it would be like for a gay student. We thought they'd get beat up or something like that. We thought there'd be a lot more issues of safety. But instead I hear behind his back a lot of criticism and a lot of hatred of just how out he was. Really bugged them.
Taking public stands in a sometimes hostile world does not diminish the inner journeys these allies take as they wrestle with the conflict they face in their own hearts and families.
We have these neighbors who live across the street, a gay couple, male couple, who are probably the best neighbors that I've ever had in my life, and they were just wonderful to my daughter. And and we say to her that they are boyfriends. She's has all these questions. I have to answer them, and she's just very direct. And it makes me realize that as comfortable as I am taking stands and as clear as I am about what they are, that it's still not totally worked out, because even though I think I give her the right answers, I can feel myself feeling really unsettled as I respond to her.
I think that if you start with children that are young and that these kind of things are accepted, then they just build an idea that there's different people in the world and that they're good, and that's a valuable thing about the world. And I hope that that's part of what comes to him from our work.
And I think for me, there's another, I'm wanting to give him the message that if he's gay, it's fine with us, although it wasn't always the case, I would add. I think I didn't feel that way in his first few years. I know I didn't. I believed at that point that if I were to talk with him about the fact that there are gay people in our lives, he would be more likely to become gay, which is very embarrassing now. Because I don't, I knew at the time, intellectually it made no sense. I knew it was totally erroneous thinking. But I believed if I brought it up, he was somehow more likely to become gay.
A lot of the fear that exists about gays and lesbians is based on the falsehoods. And if the falsehoods are confronted, then that fear will disappear. And I'm thinking particularly of the myth, the lie, that gays prey on children. And I can understand worrying about a child. As a matter of fact, I had a humbling experience not too long ago. My daughter was playing Scrabble with a man who has AIDS. And they started roughhousing. One got a word, the other one challenged, and they were pushing each other back and forth. And I was watching them sitting on the floor with this board. And for one split moment, I thought, my God, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? So having a child and loving a child and not wanting that child to come in any harm, I really understand how, if those lies persist and people are convinced by them, it's natural that people will be fearful.
There's some homophobia here, right here in this person. And so I can't go around and blame people for being homophobic, since we all pretty much are. We're kind of scared of things we don't know about. And so it helped to talk to gay people for a year and get over some of that, those fears, or maybe it's an uncertainty. You're not quite sure how you feel.
Within my culture, we don't even talk about sexuality, and I think sexuality is just hard to discuss anyway, but talking about same-sex orientations was very difficult for me. So with that, I began to explore a little bit more around being more comfortable at who I am as a heterosexual, and then moving forward into the whole area of gay, lesbian, bisexual issues.
It challenges people to think differently because it also challenges people to deal with their own prejudices. And we've had some years of history with dealing with race and color. Some much more longer years of dealing with that and coming to terms with that. It's not over, long from over. But I think it's a lot more, it's different because now you're dealing in a very, in an area that churches have taught us and societies have taught us is very taboo. I mean, I came from what I considered an enlightened family and couldn't believe that you didn't even talk about sex. My friends didn't talk about sex, and mothers and fathers didn't talk with their children about sex. So this is a whole different arena that has a whole different set of taboos on it.
It must be that we're all uncertain about our sexuality, all of us. And so we'd like to find somebody to blame for our own uncertainties. So gay and lesbian persons become wonderful projections, I think, for us, because we can say, well, I am certainly not that bad. And so but then I think in addition, we've developed certain kinds of fears about gay and lesbian persons. I think back upon my childhood, and the last thing you want to be called was a queer, and so you try to talk in a deep voice so you don't sound effeminate, and other things like this. And so all your life you have these uncertainties. And so I think they become a very convenient scapegoat.
Amid an atmosphere filled with political distortions and polarizing sentiments, the principle of justice loomed heavily in the choices these allies made to take their stands.
Clearly, Amendment 2 would have institutionalized discrimination in a way that I didn't think was appropriate. So I didn't have much second thoughts or even first thoughts about it. That was something that I felt strongly about and I'd be willing to help on. Also, I think it's because I believe that discrimination against gays and lesbians is really quite similar to discrimination against women who've been successful in areas that are non-traditional for women, or at least weren't traditional at the time I went into them. And I feel like the discrimination against gays and lesbians, although much more reprehensible in many ways, is very akin to the types of discrimination that I had experienced, or women like me, I think, have experienced, when somebody just assumes that you can't do something or you shouldn't be doing something because they don't like what you represent or who you are.
When I was the head of the Women's Health Center and we were attacked by Operation Rescue, and there were 400 people outside the clinic, I was frightened, although we had protection. I felt less personally disempowered than I did in these debates. This one hit me stronger. I care about this one in a different place, in a different way. And certainly I've been challenged, I've been criticized, I've been threatened, I've had bomb threats. But somehow that was more the role for me. Abortion, for example, while a deeply held choice and a fundamental and very challenging issue for people who are involved on either side, it is cloaked in almost political terms of choice. Who you love and how you love and with whom you love is a much more personal issue. And so I felt and feel the whole issue of homophobia, of sexual orientation differently. It's a more personal issue for me.
I talked very actively about feeling like this was not a two-sided issue, that there were a lot of things that psychologists could say, well, there's a pro or a con, or this is right or that's right. But this was one of those issues that was very clear. I mean, it was either right or it was wrong. There weren't two sides to apartheid. It was wrong, period. And I saw this one in the same frame.
In my mind, it is a very strategic, concerted effort across this country to move us into a place we were many years ago in our history, in a history where women had to march to get the right to vote, where blacks had to march and suffer a number of injustices, intolerable injustices, to get to a point in this country where they were recognized as even human beings, where Mexicans weren't treated as dogs, where Native Americans were recognized not as savages but as human beings. And not that we don't still struggle with a lot of that attitude and that, but for as a country that was, and its governance to change, its constitution, that we had to go through this evolutionary process of enlightenment, and that we're at a place where people, I feel, have developed this mechanism, very well financed political mechanism, to attempt to create that same environment of repression that many of us struggled against. And all of these are just those initiatives that set the stage for the debate, to garner the support, to begin to swing the pendulum back, if you will.
This was one you didn't want to make any mistakes on? That you wanted it done as well as it could possibly be done, because the ramifications of not doing it well were astronomical, at least from my viewpoint. This is one of those cases that not only was it important for Colorado, but other places in the country were watching it. And I really felt that there was an awful lot of pressure to be sure we did the very best job anybody could possibly do with this. That was the hardest part.
In the ongoing public debate over gay rights, greater numbers of people were being intimidated into silence, and it took more and more courage for allies to find their voices.
It makes you paranoid. After the election, I had promised myself I was going to wear not a no on two button, but a P flag or some sort of supportive, affirming kind of button. And it got to the point that every time a grocery clerk was rude to me or someone didn't wait on me in a restaurant, that I started thinking it's my button. And we really can't give in to that, because in being silent, in being hidden, we really are powerless. And if we're powerless, things will never change.
It's important to me to be accepted, and it's important for me to be respected by a group of people that I want to be a part of. And some of that is just like the mainstream of America. And I like to be accepted by those people, and I don't want to be singled out and isolated. And yet, this belief is so strong to me, and this work that I do is so strong, that it is something that singles me out and isolates me from the mainstream in that respect. And it doesn't feel good to me. It's that being on the outside that doesn't feel good to me, but I'm not willing to compromise my values or my beliefs to be on the inside. So again, it's that whole thing of wishing I could be part of the family, but recognizing the family's not healthy, and part of it makes me sad. And then, I mean, every time I get that kind of phone call, I think about a group of kids in the public schools that are feeling disenfranchised and know on some level that hate is out there.
Someone who was gay told me that when you're gay, you can tell your parents that you can go ahead and have a life, and you can have the house and the picket fence and pretty well carry on, but the one thing you can't guarantee is your safety. And when you're an out person, when you're gay and you're out, you can't always guarantee to your parents that you'll be safe, and that's really hard for parents to take. And so getting involved like this, it's the same kind of a thing. I couldn't guarantee my parents, my mother, my husband, my kids that I would be safe, and pretty soon it all slips away that, nobody could really guarantee that they'd be safe either.
What do you do with pain? Well, you hurt, and you cry, and you feel the loss, because it's terribly painful to have people that I've grown to love to leave the church, or to be mad, or to write you nasty letters, or to leave your company and no longer have supper with you. That's very sad.
I think there's something about aligning oneself with truth that's liberating, no matter how painful that is and what the risks are. And it's something that I can see as right there with some of the heroes that I hold up. When I think about Harriet Tubman, or I think about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, those are people who I really see as having aligned themselves with truth, and having and people who took some risks as a result of it. But when you study any of their lives, you see that they're people that felt extremely excited about what they were doing. It was this contradiction between the danger that they exposed themselves to and the internal feeling that they had, which was one of feeling totally exhilarated and at peace with what they were doing.
I was raised in a household and by a father who taught me that by your silence and by your lack of action, you in fact are supporting people's continued discrimination and prejudice and injustice and inequality, that you needed to always act against that kind of behavior and activity, that you needed to be willing to stand up. And he often said, that may be that you stand alone, but better that you stand alone and have your principles and your integrity, and you can wake up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror and know that you've done what you need to do, than to be with a multitude of people and that would be driven like sheep in the same direction, perpetrating the same injustice.
There's a wonderful expression in my tradition by a second century rabbi. He says, the tasks are great and the workers are sluggish and so on, and it is not incumbent upon us to finish the task, but we are not free to desist from it altogether. And that in and of itself is a reward, because you know that you're participating in something that's going to make this country a better place.
Many people trip through life never knowing how powerful they are. Every single person has an inordinate amount of personal power to change everything around them. And if you've never had the opportunity to experience that, you don't know. But to be given that opportunity in a lot of different areas, I feel really fortunate. And it really has been an infusion of passion.
There's a personal vulnerability that I have seen among members of this congregation when they have sensed that there is an affirmation of their personhood and their worth. There has been a different kind of vulnerability with those persons, and the gifts that they have given to me of their friendship, their subversive humor that allows them to survive, gives me a tremendous amount of strength and courage, and to know that God speaks with them and walks with them the same as God speaks with me and my family and those with whom I'm friends. And I think those personal relationships are what gives me the strength to understand God's call to speak and to be present.
I think I've been able to speak a word of truth, and I think there's some satisfaction that I personally feel, because I've been able to be a leader in a cause that I think is very right.
It made me go back and read a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed that I read on and off, and you can tell it's all dog-eared and torn. And one piece in there that Paulo Freire speaks about is that if, and I, of course, am paraphrasing, if you are truly a freedom fighter and you see yourself in that light, an advocate of justice and a fighter for people's liberation, that you must be willing to do that for all people. And you must be willing to do that for all people so they will have the choice to live their life the way they choose, not the way you want them to.
I can't be focused on enemies. I have to be focused on myself. I have to be focused on what I can do to change things. I can't be saying, well, these people should be doing this and those people should be doing that. I have to figure out what I can do. And the spirituals have, there's just so much in them that have to do with that. And when I became aware of that, it just was crystal clear. You know, a song like "It's Me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer." You know, it's me standing. It's me, it's me, it's me, O Lord, standing in need of prayer. It's me, it's me, it's me, O Lord, standing in need of prayer. It's not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. That's just so clear. It's, you know, it's not, I'm not going to be able to do anything by blaming other people. I have to take responsibility for what I'm doing.